You have no idea what the words "only artillery activity in Flanders today," printed in a simple and light-hearted way in the newspapers, actually mean for us. For the past 3 hours, a corporal has been lying next to me, moaning, with one arm and both legs torn off by a shell. All day long, artillery fire has been raining down on us. Rather than constantly wondering whether the next shell will cripple or tear us apart, it's much better to launch the boldest attack at any cost. In 1917, the world was now fully at war. The number of fronts and belligerent states had significantly increased. However, these increases favored the Entente powers. The Central Powers, led by Germany, were inching closer to inevitable defeat. Having attacked the French at Verdun, the Germans received their response from the British at the Somme. While both battles were still ongoing, the Brusilov offensive coming from the east strained the Germans, both in terms of supplies and manpower. The German armies, spread over a vast front, were no longer capable of defending such an extended line. The possibility of the front breaking was dangerously high. The Germans were in no condition to endure another Battle of the Somme. The army was exhausted to counter the Russian successes in the east. Troops also had to be redirected there. Paul von Hindenburg, who replaced Falkenhayn as chief of the general staff, recognized the situation. In early September, a meeting was held with Erich von Ludendorff and other commanders. Hindenburg asked Western Front commanders for suggestions on a new and shorter defensive line to be built in France. He would tell them that no reserves remained for operations, apart from those planned for Romania. General Jörg Fuchs proposed building a defensive line from Arras to west of Laon. This would shorten the front by 40 kilometers and free up about 10 divisions for an offensive in Alsace-Lorraine. During the same period, the French and British armies were planning a major offensive. At the end of 1916, Joseph Joffre was removed from command of the French armies and replaced by Robert Nivelle. Nivelle was a confident and eloquent commander. In 1917, he presented a new operational plan promising a decisive victory. The plan required the British to carry out a diversionary attack near Arras to distract the Germans from the French offensive. Nivelle would employ the same tactics he had used successfully at Verdun to crush the Germans within 48 hours. The plan echoed the promises made since the beginning of the war. The Germans would supposedly be routed within 2 days and retreat toward Berlin. Both Douglas Haig and Philippe Pétain were skeptical of Nivelle's plan. However, Nivelle's powers of persuasion were as effective as his command. He first convinced French politicians. To the soldiers, he said victory is near. There would be no more Verduns, and thousands of lives would not be sacrificed for minor gains. Don't worry, Nivelle promised. If my plan fails within 48 hours, I will halt the offensive. Everyone wanted to believe these familiar sweet words one more time. The French put their trust in Nivelle with the last drops of confidence they had. As the French prepared for a massive offensive, the Germans were preparing a move that would largely disrupt Nivelle's plans. Around this time, Nivelle made a critical mistake. He began promoting the offensive to politicians and journalists. The Germans noticed this publicity and realized the French were preparing for an attack. German reconnaissance planes flew continuously over the Western Front throughout the winter of 1916 to 1917 to find signs of Anglo-French offensive preparations. During one trench raid, the Germans also captured plans related to the French attack. A major crisis loomed for the French. For the construction of the new defensive line, 12,000 Germans, 3,000 Belgian workers, and 50,000 prisoners of war, mostly Russians, labored. While the new line was being built, the Germans planned massive destruction in the areas they vacated. Everything of value in the French countryside was destroyed. Roads were damaged, wells poisoned, houses booby-trapped, and the local population evacuated. Only barren land was left behind. With Hindenburg's approval, the retreat to the infamous Hindenburg Line, prepared over 5 months, took place in February-March 1917. The area where Nivelle planned to launch his offensive was precisely where the Germans had pulled back after inflicting horrific devastation. The Nivelle offensive, named after its planner and jointly carried out by the French and British, began on April 9, 1917, with the British diversionary attack, the Battle of Arras. The British successfully deployed soldiers and tanks to the front with great secrecy and launched a surprise assault using effective artillery. Under General Edmund Allenby, the British Third Army and the Canadian Corps attacked along a 23-kilometre front following a preparatory bombardment by 2,800 artillery pieces. After a week of fighting at Arras, on April 16th, the French offensive began under General Nivelle's command. Known to history as the Nivelle Offensive, this operation would bring disastrous results for both sides and mark the tank's first appearance in 1917. British tanks appeared at Arras, while French tanks made their debut at Chemin des Dames. The French Schneider CA tank was unveiled here for the first time. But the Germans had already encountered tanks at the Somme. As a countermeasure, they had dug wider trenches along the Hindenburg Line. They also used armor-piercing bullets and aircraft against tanks. The French were inexperienced with tanks, and infantry-tank coordination was lacking. As a result, defeat for the tanks was inevitable. Most tanks broke down before reaching their targets. Those that did were hit by aircraft and artillery or abandoned by their crews. The British had also not learned enough from the Somme. Tanks were still scattered among infantry units. Moreover, spring weather conditions were harsh, snow from winter remained, and heavy rains persisted. Artillery support failed due to poor weather. Many tanks lost their way, broke down, and suffered heavy losses. Like the offensive itself, the tank assault achieved no significant results beyond minor gains. Robert Nivelle continued the offensive he had promised, would drive the Germans back to Germany within 48 hours for a full 23 days. The British suffered 150,000 casualties, the Germans 130,000, and the French nearly 200,000. The soldiers at the front had had enough. They were about to revolt against their commanders in an almost unprecedented manner. Poilus, who had been fighting for 3 years, were utterly exhausted. In every senseless and pointless assault, thousands were cut down by machine guns, wire, artillery, gas, and more. On May 3rd, the 21st Division, which had endured the harsh conditions of Verdun, did not respond to their commander's order to attack. French officers were shocked. The real shock came when other units along the same line followed suit. About 30,000 soldiers from over 50 divisions were now saying enough was enough. They were abandoning the front and rushing to see their families, whom they hadn't seen in years. Those who didn't desert mostly remained in the trenches but still refused to follow orders. It was believed that the disobedience that had begun in Russia at the time influenced the French army. However, these events stemmed more from the soldiers' dire conditions than from politics. The Poilus, who received the lowest pay and endured the worst rations among Allied armies, hadn't had leave in years. After the disaster of the Nivelle offensive, despair settled over the French soldiers. They could no longer go on under such conditions. Having failed to deliver on any of his promises, Nivelle was dismissed. General Pétain, his replacement, would improve the conditions for his troops and meet many of their demands. He told the soldiers exactly what they most wanted to hear. From now on, their lives would not be wasted in futile attacks. Aware of the army's fragile state, Pétain allowed only limited offensives. In his words, the Allies would wait for tanks and America's entry into the war before attempting such madness again. 1917 was a year of significant developments for tanks. Drawing on their experience, the British began to improve their designs. As a continuation of the Mark series, the Mark II and Mark III tanks were introduced. However, while these models featured only minor improvements, they played no major role in combat. The real change came with the Mark IV. It was essentially a sum of the modifications and corrections made to the first three models. As one of the most produced and widely used tanks of the First World War, its success spoke for itself. The Mark IV's superiority lay in the correction of earlier design flaws. One of the major issues with earlier models was their weak armor. Previously, only the front of the tank was protected by a strong plate. This plating was now applied to all sides except the rear. The Lewis machine gun, one of the most effective weapons of the war and well liked by soldiers, was now installed on tanks as well. The transition to a softer edged and taller vehicle not only prevented technical problems with the tracks, but also enabled the tank to climb out of deep craters more easily. The engine also posed serious problems. While tanks often had a shock effect, the noise and exhaust smoke made them easily detectable even at night. For this reason, the Mark IV was fitted with an exhaust pipe equipped with a long silencer. Horsepower was also increased to improve speed. The British would go on to identify the Mark IV as the ideal tank. There was another critical development regarding tanks for the first time. Tanks were deployed outside the Western Front and trenches. They were sent to a very familiar place, Palestine Front. The Turks would encounter tanks for the first time during the battles of Gaza in Palestine. Although these tanks, deployed against the Ottoman Empire, showed some effectiveness, the Ottomans managed to stop 8 Mark I tanks during the Second Battle of Gaza. However, in the Third Battle of Gaza, the British Army, reinforced with 5 tanks, attacked the Ottomans from an unexpected direction, defeated them, and opened the way for the fall of Palestine. Alongside improvements to the Mark series, the British also began developing lighter tanks. Just 5 days after the Mark I was unveiled at the Somme, General Haig tasked William Triton with producing a light tank. The main feature desired in this tank was speed. While the Mark performed well in trenches and defensive lines, Haig wanted a faster vehicle to gain an advantage in pursuing the enemy. Among soldiers, this vehicle came to be known as the Chaser. In operations, it was often used alongside cavalry rather than infantry. These medium-class tanks, influenced by the design of Little Willie, were called Whippets. The Whippet had 2 powerful engines. If one engine was hit or failed, the other could keep the vehicle moving. Like cars, the engines were mounted in the front. Thanks to its small size and lightweight, it was twice as fast as the Mark tanks. However, it was not as successful at crossing trenches. Its effective maneuverability allowed it to operate in villages, towns, narrow and rough terrain, and wooded areas. What made the Whippet truly significant was the inspiration it provided to the French. General Aisne, the driving force behind French tank efforts, was greatly impressed by this small hound. The first 2 French tanks had been nightmares, and a new solution was desperately needed. France no longer wanted to produce the CA1 and the Saint-Chamond, both of which placed a heavy burden on its industry. Aware of this, Estienne began working on a cheap and easily produced tank inspired by British medium tanks. There were doubts about the effectiveness of such a small and light tank, but the general trusted his idea. He believed a light, highly mobile tank could be easily transported to desired locations and would offer major advantages. Taking a major gamble, Estienne ordered hundreds of tanks during the design phase. But this gamble would become one of the most successful in the war. Louis Renault and engineer Rudolf Ernst Metzmeier would go on to produce a tank that would be considered the ancestor of modern tanks. Its features would serve as a model for many successful tanks produced in the future. They dared to do something that had previously been considered, but never implemented. The tank would have a rotating turret capable of 360-degree movement. As in the Mark series, tanks would be classified as male or female. Female tanks would be equipped with Hotchkiss machine guns, while male versions would mount a 37mm cannon. While the tank's small size and speed were advantages, it suffered from a weight imbalance that leaned forward. To address this, modifications were made to the track assembly. Instead of using two equally sized axles as in standard Holt tracks, the front axle was enlarged. A tail extension was added to the rear to improve balance, resulting in a small but stable vehicle. Tanks that had entered the battlefield in late 1916 underwent massive development in 1917 and were now beginning to influence the outcome of the war. In the summer of 1917, the British were nearing the peak of their tank production capacity. Tanks were no longer a secret, and tank units were now referred to as the Tank Corps. Mark IV tanks had entered service and received training for mass assaults. When the French Nivelle offensive ended in disaster, the British, hoping to relieve pressure on their allies, began preparing a major offensive. Additionally, the Germans had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare and were tightening the noose around the island nation of Britain. General Haig believed that a successful offensive could help capture key Belgian ports. If successful, the German submarine campaign and supply routes would be dealt a heavy blow. But before launching the offensive, the lines needed to be secured. To the right of the salient in the north was Messines Ridge, held by the Germans. This 46-meter-high ridge dominated the area and had to be captured. The British had a unique surprise in store for the Germans. Underground mining techniques, developed to solve the stalemate of trench warfare, had been in use for some time. Miners and engineers had dug tunnels and planted explosives beneath enemy trenches in earlier battles, causing major disruption. Both sides had become proficient in this type of warfare, but what was prepared at here would surpass all previous efforts. There was as much activity below the ground as above it. As the fronts widened and trenches stretched on, the conflict gradually extended into the earth itself. From 1916 onward, both sides began constructing vast underground tunnel systems. However, the Germans made a big mistake in this region. Prince Ruprecht's Army Group Chief of Staff, Hermann Joseph Kuhl, held a meeting with commanders of the 4th Army to review the area's defense. The consensus was that no exceptional measures were needed, the lines had been updated, and the artillery was expected to perform effectively. Even the German tunnels were considered strong enough to endure a possible attack. Reports seemed to confirm this confidence. But something very unexpected lay ahead. A day before the planned offensive, on June 7th, 2nd Army Commander Charles Harrington addressed his men with a memorable line. "Gentlemen, I don't know if we will write history tomorrow, but we will certainly change geography." His words were not without reason. British engineers had placed a massive amount of explosive material, 450 tons, under the hill. Before sunrise, British artillery opened fire, only to fall silent moments before the sun appeared. On both sides, soldiers waited, Germans ready in their lines, the British anticipating the command to move. A quiet 20-minute pause followed. The battlefield grew so still that birdsong carried through the air. Everyone was bracing for what would come next. Then suddenly, in less than half a minute, a chain of powerful underground detonations reshaped the landscape, carving out 19 vast craters. Within seconds, thousands of German troops were caught in the blasts. The coordinated detonation had a profound effect on morale, stunning and overwhelming those who witnessed it. Some accounts described soldiers losing their sense of direction entirely. The sound was said to be the loudest man-made noise of its time, reportedly reaching as far as London, some 200 kilometers away, and even Dublin. In Lille, France, it was compared to an earthquake. This was the deadliest single-moment loss of life in history. Messines would go down in history for both the massive mining operation and the first battlefield appearance of the new British Mark IV tank. Anticipating a tank assault, the Germans had mined terrain where tanks were likely to advance and used poison gas to hinder night movement. Nevertheless, the mass tank assault, combined with artillery clearing the mines, succeeded. Tanks once again exerted psychological dominance and helped capture numerous prisoners. For the first time, aircraft operated alongside tanks, in addition to artillery and infantry. German armor-piercing rounds failed this time because the thin armor of earlier models had been replaced. In the week-long Battle of Messines, tanks and supporting forces achieved notable success. General Haig was now ready to launch his main offensive to seize the Belgian coast. He selected General Hubert Goff's Fifth Army as the main force, but this was a mistake. Unfamiliar with the terrain around Flanders, Goff favored a deep breakthrough. Though Haig warned him not to repeat General Nivelle's errors, Goff ignored the advice. The Germans, expecting a British assault at Ypres, had reinforced their already strong defences. Worst of all was the terrain. The Ypres region, close to the sea, was fertile farmland with many irrigation ditches, canals, and dikes. The Germans, holding 5 defensive trench lines, deliberately destroyed local infrastructure, creating swamps and thick mud in front of their lines. The terrain, already torn by shelling, was disastrous for tanks. In what would be known as the Third Battle of Ypres, 216 Mark IV tanks were deployed, but Passchendaele would prove a nightmare for everyone. Infantry and artillery struggled to function. Night maneuvers were chaotic. Mud. It was everywhere, where we rested, where we ate, where we marched, a heavy, endless stretch of wet earth. Some fell into it and never came back up, others grew weaker and faded within it. Footing was uncertain. Men slipped into pools where water and soil had mixed. Signs of hardship were scattered all around. A glove here, a torn boot there moving forward felt like walking through a bad dream. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. Just more craters and thick, clinging mud. Rifles stood upright in the ground, quietly marking the places where others had once stood. Most tanks became stuck in the mud. For the first time, tanks also came under aerial attack. The 100-day nightmare of Passchendaele ended with 300,000 casualties on both sides. The Third Battle of Ypres was essentially the Somme of 1917. During this time, JFC Fuller, one of the most vocal supporters of tank warfare, had planned a surprise raid on the Cambrai region, considered the most tank-friendly area of the Hindenburg Line. Cambrai and its surroundings had not been heavily bombarded and weren't plagued by the mud of Passchendaele. Fuller presented his plan to British Third Army Commander Julian Byng, who approved it. But it was initially rejected by General Haig due to the ongoing Passchendaele disaster. After witnessing the nightmare of Ypres unfold for a third time, Haig finally gave the green light for a morale-boosting success. As 1917 came to a close, the Western Front would witness one of the largest and most effective tank offensives of the war at Cambrai. But the biggest surprise came from another nation: Germany. The Germans had finally begun developing their own tank. A monstrous hybrid of the Mark, Schneider and St. Chamond designs. Soon, tanks would face tanks. Until now, tanks had been designed to support infantry. From now on, infantry would exist to support the tanks.